Good morning. I'm Ted Cooley. This is the 11th lecture of a series in response to Zien's People's History of the United States, covering chapters 21 and 22 of his book. Chapter 21. Certainly, this is one of the more depressing chapters in the book. The changes done after the Nixon debacle were not sufficient to change the direction of the bureaucracy. Carter, as governor of Georgia, did not have enough experience with the Washington bureaucracy to effect the needed changes. Rather, he chose to include several who represented the past policies of the Nixon and Ford administrations. In particular, the gap between the rich and the poor was allowed to grow. Carter himself opposed tax changes, increasing the disparity in wealth, though Congress overruled him. His good intentions were overcome by the weight of the establishment, much to the damage of the country with what lay ahead. The press media was handling out general pulp with the beginnings of the right-wing media on its own course. Carter's background in the Navy and as a Southern farmer simply did not catch on to the possible dangers of this alternate media presence. The radio talk shows and the right-wing press increased greatly under Carter, though he did not seem to be aware of it. The Trilateral Commission of the previous advisors to Nixon and Ford continued its influence, even to having members of this organization high in the Carter administration. Such a combination of brains and large corporate contacts served to control enough of the administration that the needs of the poor, regardless of race, continued to be ignored. The same pro-business leaders under Nixon continued to advise with little presence for opposition views. Zim notes that, quote, Carter had Wall Street's confidence, unquote, and support of the upper class of the commercial world. Even in the processes of walking away from the Panama Canal, he had the support of the commercial world, as the original canal was not large enough to accommodate the then current tankers, container ships, or aircraft carriers. It would have been a breach of security to send our subs through, as it would have given away some of their acoustical characteristics and locations at a point in time. The political right, below the surface, in talk radio and chat rooms, was in strong opposition to the Canal Treaty, despite the clear commercial, political, and patriotic advantages of walking away from the Panama Canal. The School of the Americas continued, the OPEC gas embargo hit, and the Iranian Revolution more or less ended his career. Some of this might have been avoided if he had not continued the support of so many oppressive regimes in the world. Thus, his one term ended with the U.S. weaker rather than stronger, despite some attempts at improving the country at home and its overseas image. While Carter chipped away somewhat at environmental regulations in the name of increased commercial activity, Reagan set out to simply ignore or destroy environmental regulations. Kevin Phillips, a Republican advisor, commented, quote, the 1980s were the triumph of upper America, the political ascendancy of the rich, and a glorification of capitalism, free markets, and finance, unquote. This was supported by tax cuts for the rich, the unproven idea of trickle-down economics, and an increase in military spending with cuts for programs for the poor. The poor were campaigned against as lazy, unproductive, and, quote, welfare Cadillacs, unquote. In 1986, legislation caused the tax rate to become equal for all incomes, at least overall, abolishing the idea from the progressive era of a progressive tax where the wealthy would pay more. From 1977 to 1989, the top 1% of incomes went up 77%, while the bottom 2/5 remained the same or decreased. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, the military budget continued to increase. One of the most expensive boondoggles was the attempt at Star Wars as a missile defense. This was an attempt to take the weaponization of ballistic missiles and their similarities into outer space, despite international treaties banning such attempts. The technology at that time was not close to success, with all the tests ending in failure. The international relationship of bullying continued, with the Iran-Contra affair showing illegal activity in Central America despite congressional legislation to the contrary, which was signed by Reagan himself outlawing such activity. The tendency for the U.S. to push around Latin American countries, which dates to the Monroe Doctrine, simply continued, despite public opinion gradually moving against it. The investment of U.S. corporations in Latin America encouraged the government to act to support the corporations despite the immoral practices of many of these corporations. Despite the revelations of illegality in the dealing with both Iran, a supposed enemy, and the Contras against past legislation, the only person jailed with respect to this scandal was a war protester. Oliver North became an item of praise in certain circles of the U.S., which supported unlimited U.S. interference in Latin America. A similar action was the Mayaguez ship incident, which involved U.S. military actions in parts of Cambodia, even after the U.S. civilian sailors captured were already on their way to release. The most ironic of these actions was the Grenada invasion, where it was reported that Reagan finally picked on a target his own size. There was no proof that the U.S. students at a medical school there were ever in danger. Both the governments of Cuba and Grenada advised the United States before the invasion took place that they could assure the U.S. government that no harm would come to the students. Our involvement in El Salvador has gone on for years. When Archbishop Romero advised the United States that the military in that country were killing civilians without reason, the U.S. did nothing. Romero was assassinated within a month following this warning. In 1986, Reagan ordered a bombing on Libya in response to a terrorist attack in Berlin, Germany, though proof of the connection had not been established. This bombing was regarded in some non-U.S. circles as the worst terrorist attack of the year against civilians. President Bush continued these policies with attacks in Panama and Iraq. In Panama, to replace the drug-dealing president there, though the flow of drugs did not decrease their coming into the United States, and in Iraq, to show the power of the U.S. in the Middle East following the embarrassing loss in Vietnam, for no nuclear weapons of mass destruction or even significant progress on such were ever found. Hussein, however, did have poisonous gas weapons, a different kind of weapon of mass destruction. But these came from materials purchased with U.S. government approval from the United States companies. Some have speculated that the Iraqi war was to position Bush in better position for the 1992 election, a matter of domestic politics. The removal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait was considered a great celebration, though no effort was made to change leadership in Iraq, as Hussein was an acceptable balance of power to Iran next door. The Kurds, in revolt at that time, were simply abandoned to the Iraqi government to do with as they wished. This ability to abandon the Kurds, one of the more progressive ethnic groups in the Middle East, continues to today. Chapter 22. This chapter presents some aspects of the left-wing underground which remained from the cultural transformation of the 60s. Zen seems to emphasize resistance to the military, with only short sections on civil rights, women's rights, the LGBTQ uprising, and in particular, the continued impact of folk, rap, and protest music upon the larger culture. There is a section on anti-nuclear protests, though it is now quite dated. In fact, with Chernobyl, it was dated when Zen wrote, "For the level of that radioactive disaster received worldwide press." A new cover for the contaminated power plant at Chernobyl was installed last year, though it is considered good for only another 100 years, while the radiation will remain dangerous for thousands of years ahead. Pit production for weapons is still being supported by a few in the industry, though the current inventory of such items far exceeds any possible application in either Russia or the US. From its usage of nuclear power for electricity, Japan literally has tons of the recycled stuff in storage, just needing the machining and processing to supply the whole third world with this very poisonous element and lots of bombs. One of the Department of Defense designs, the quote, Davy Crockett, unquote, scared our European allies so much with its deployment in Europe that the United States government removed it from the theater of operations and now acts as if it never existed. Having a sergeant and corporal running around the German forest with a deliverable nuclear warhead with a range of over a mile even produced some level of reasonableness in the Pentagon. Some of these excesses produced a limited nuclear freeze in 1983, though this has primarily elapsed now. Still, some level of reasonableness entered into the policy of the opposing powers. Zen tends to present the opposition to the military's excesses from the viewpoint of the low-ranking soldier or relatives of such. Actually, a number of high-ranking officers were far more aware of the futility of nuclear excesses than the politicians. Unfortunately, the tradition of political neutrality from the armed services was a disservice for the country, and they're taking a neutral attitude towards weapons excesses. Our military adventurism in Latin America and other parts of the world continued, though with an increasing lack of success. Congress formally opposed Reagan's actions in El Salvador, though he went around this. The policy towards apartheid regime in South America brought significant opposition from within Congress. The response to the Black Power movement simply resulted in the building of more jails and filling them up. Reagan's actions in Nicaragua probably produced the strongest reaction, though the historians will work for years to untangle some of the other actions, such as his support of the white regime in South Africa. Zinn's citation of college students and protests throughout the country during the Reagan administration is interesting, though lacking a systematic organization. As a major focus of Reagan's presidency, the destruction of government in general, the amount of damage he was actually able to do, despite his popularity, is remarkably small. The shift to lower taxes, particularly the capital gains tax, which really favored the wealthy at the expense of decreasing programs for the poor, characterized both the Reagan and Bush administrations. A 1989 survey showed that there was a need and desire for a Canadian-type universal health care program, which received no support from either party. Eisenhower's military and industrial complex statements warning was totally ignored in these years as the military continued to develop weapons like the Osprey, often to correct combat problems in Vietnam, while the solutions were no longer appropriate for the increased technology of the developing world, military world in 2020, such as this hybrid aircraft currently based in Albuquerque. In this, Zinn shows a lack of appreciation for the two-party system in the United States. What he might actually prefer seems vague. Protests could and did take place, but there was little effort to follow up with corrective action, unlike the current administration, which is trying to destroy any possibility of corrective action. The use of the CIA for international action instead of simply intelligence, as well as using the FBI for unlimited domestic surveillance, violates the law establishing these agencies. Fortunately, many of the protesters charged were acquitted by the juries when they viewed the actual rights and laws involved. Throughout the country, various protest groups developed. Latino workers, particularly in the Southwest, women throughout the country, LGBT movements in the cities, and a general feeling of unrest among the poor characterized the later part of the Reagan and Bush administrations. Though none of this was really reflected in the voting patterns, the possibility for further change was becoming apparent. The 1991 First Gulf War brought out both the residual anti-war movement of the 60s and a new realization that war in the oil-rich Middle East was a can of worms. Reagan had already lost a number of troops in Lebanon, though why they were there in the first place was never adequately explained. The buildup for the first Gulf War was quick, as the administration believed that getting it over with was needed, as the anti-war movement in many areas was clearly increasing, both from the previous Vietnam fiasco and the multiple, quote, rights, unquote, movements coming to the front among many groups in society. This was quickly done with far more civilian casualties than officially reported. Still, this left a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of the public. The general unrest, though not of a massive nature, still undermined the Bush presidency, which, coupled with an economic downturn, led to an administration change in 1992. This followed the collapse of the Soviet Union's control of Eastern Europe in 1989, which should have produced a, quote, peace, unquote, dividend. Instead of this decrease in arms expenditures. The 1991 Gulf War kept the military in funds, though social programs continued to suffer. Accompanying this was the pressure to turn the impending 400th anniversary of Columbus into a, quote, Indigenous Peoples Day, unquote. All of these movements, though not united, gave evidence of impending social changes, which produced a reaction of fear among those comfortable with the past or afraid of the, quote, other, unquote, in what was becoming a very diverse society. The increasing cultural divide certainly holds short-term threats. The largely male, white, and over 65 nature of those holding onto their ideas of a more perfect past stand as an anachronism which is trying to hold back the waves of time. This concludes lecture number 11. Thank you.